Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Joe Davidge. I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. And on behalf of the Georgia Center for the Book, DeKalb County Library, welcome to another in our virtual author talks that we began once the pandemic started in middle March. We'd like to thank a few people this evening, especially the DeKalb Library Foundation. The DeKalb Library Foundation is the fundraising arm of our library system that provides funding for programs such as this Zoom meeting, as well as 1,000 Books Before Kindergarten and Take the Internet Home, which allows patrons to take small mobile internet devices home to access the internet in areas where internet is unaffordable or simply unattainable. We would also like to let you know that this evening, if you'd like to purchase a book, you can, of course, click the link that is provided in the chat for Karis Books and More. They're an independent bookstore here in Decatur, Georgia, and they will mail the book to your doorstep for a small fee. We also like to thank all of our independent bookstores that have been working with us during this time. They've been doing a great job with curbside pickup and at-home delivery. And if you don't live in the greater Atlanta area, we do encourage you to go ahead and just visit or order from your local independent bookstores. It's always great to support independents in the community, whether they're a small store or a large store, or whether they are a Black-owned business, which we've also been telling people to support. If you have Black-owned businesses or independent bookstores owned by Black individuals, please also support them as well. We'd like to thank Mercer University Press, who of course published the book this evening, and Mary Beth Krakowski down there, who put us on to doing this event. And we look forward to working with them more in the future as well. So just a few housekeeping things. If, of course, you would like to ask a question tonight, you can either type it into the chat and I will read it out loud during the Zoom talk, or if you would like and you have the raise your hand feature, you can use that and we will recognize you and you can ask the question yourself. We do ask, though, that if you keep your microphone muted, it will just go ahead and cut down on a little bit of the background noise and make sure that the camera doesn't switch to folks that aren't presenting this evening. It's located in the upper right of your screen on most devices. So if you could do that, we'd appreciate it a lot. Thank you. So I'm very pleased tonight to welcome our two guests, E. Jane Doering and Ruthann Knechel Johnson, to talk to you about their new book, Where Fiction and Philosophy Meet, a conversation with Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil. They're going to do a talk this evening entitled Reading Toward Justice, Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil in Conversation. E. Jane Doering is the Director Emerita of the Teachers Scholars Program at the University of Notre Dame, where she taught French language and literature. She holds degrees from Northwestern University, the University of Notre Dame, Goucher College, Douglas College of Rutgers University, and the Sorbonne. Doering is the author of Simone Weil and the Spectre of Self-Perpetuating Force. Ruthann Knechel Johnson is an interdisciplinary teacher and scholar. She is the Professor Emerita at the University of Notre Dame and President Emerita of Bethany Theological Seminary. She holds degrees from Drew University, Columbia University, and Manchester College. Johansen is the author of The Narrative Secret of Flannery O'Connor, The Trickster as the Interpreter. We thank you so much for coming, and please welcome E. Jane Doering and Ruthann Knechel Johansen.
Jane and I are very pleased to be part of the Georgia Center for the Book Summer Series. Indeed, Flannery O'Connor has been receiving special attention this year with the release of Elizabeth Kaufman's and Mark Bosco's documentary titled Flannery, and the publication of impressive new books such as Angela O'Donnell's Radical Ambivalence and Ruth Ranishi's Sign Language. Amidst the pandemic, which has made distressingly visible long-standing, invidious social injustices, the works and attitudes of O'Connor are receiving scrutiny, as we have seen recently in Paul Ely's New Yorker article, How Racist Was Flannery O'Connor? Into this mix Jane and I offer a conversation between Flannery O'Connor and the French philosopher Simone Weil. An impossible conversation in their lifetimes. On the surface, it may even seem today unusual. But because of the questions they raise for us, we find their vision and ideas presciently relevant for this time. First, this evening, we will try to situate briefly each author in her context from which her works emerged. Second, we will explain why and how we brought them together. And then third, using a well-known story of Flannery O'Connor's, we will illustrate how O'Connor embodies in fiction several of Weil's concepts to point toward the mystery of truth, beauty, and love embedded in the universe and even in the misperceptions and distortions of our lives. Finally, we will suggest how bringing them into conversation, we think, enlarges our understanding of both O'Connor's and Weil's enduring interest and relevance. So our aim this evening is to demonstrate how both Weil and O'Connor perceived and were committed to the unity of the material and spiritual worlds. Both used their prophetic imaginations to bear witness to that reality, even as they believed many people had abandoned a sense of the sacred. O'Connor and Weil sought to understand the truth of the human condition and what might contribute to social orders rooted in truth and justice. As a philosopher, they envisioned the attributes necessary for such an order. O'Connor's startlingly engaging, if unsettling fiction, unmasks values and behaviors that ignore the beauty and order of the world and obstruct the realization of genuine justice based on the love of neighbor.
As colleagues at the University of Notre Dame, Ruthann and I began our collaboration after each publishing separately on our chosen writer, then teaching the works of both women in a great books format, and indulging in long conversations about the resonances we observed between O'Connor's fiction and Weil's philosophy. Our presentation this evening will reflect the way we worked on the book. Each of us wanted to honor the form in which her author wrote, Weil's philosophical exposition and O'Connor's literary fiction. The book became, in effect, a four-voiced conversation. Weil and O'Connor with Doering and Johansen. We will move back and forth in our responses to several ideas elaborated in the book in the hope that you'll be inspired to explore further. We begin by situating these two 20th century women writers in their specific contexts, for they each lived in very difficult times. Simone Weil, born in 1909 in Paris, died at the age of 34 in England in 1943, while trying desperately to get back into France to participate in the resistance and to form a nurses' corps for the injured. The sufferings from war and the increased stranglehold of the rising totalitarian regimes created a constant drumbeat foreboding a new conflagration. As a young girl, Simone had accompanied her physician father on rounds of caring for the horribly wounded veterans of World War I. In the 1930s, fascism in Italy, National Socialism in Germany, Stalinist communism in Russia, and the Spanish civil conflict were crushing people's aspirations for living with dignity. At the same time, industrialization was transforming the workplace, by destroying traditional work methods, creating mind-numbing work, and eliminating all necessity to think. The effect of this oppressive environment on the human spirit profoundly distressed Simone Weil. Weil considered the ability to think as humankind's most essential quality. She wanted every aspect of one's existence to be an apprenticeship in reflection on relationships that nurture equality, dignity, and a sense of obligation to oneself and to others. She approached the labor problems rationally, urging cooperation among the workers, stressing their strength in numbers, and insisting on their need for a work environment that maintained and furthered their self-esteem. But to little avail. Eventually, after 3 mystical contacts with Christianity, the major encounter occurring in 1938, her central religious philosophical preoccupation became the sacredness of every individual. She focused on the harm oppression causes to the sacred aspect of both victim and perpetrator. As her philosophy increasingly embraced a religious aura, she drafted a statement of human obligations, which she hoped would become a profession of good faith required of future leaders. These detailed obligations assume, of course, the needs of the body, but in their originality, they also list the needs of the soul, which are paired in balancing opposites: liberty and obedience, equality and hierarchy, honor and punishment, freedom of opinion and responsibility, security and risk, private property and collective property. Reigning over all is the crucial need for truth, order, and justice. This innovative list prefaces her last work, The Need for Roots, in which the relationship between the material and the divine is laid out in careful detail.
In fiction arising from the red clay soil of Georgia, with reach far beyond the southern United States, Flannery O'Connor illustrates the latent potential for human illusion and destructiveness. An Irish Catholic raised in the Protestant South, O'Connor internalized the ambiguities of her own immigrant history, the unsettled legacies of the Civil War, a formation shaped by the Second World War and racial and class divisions, the Civil Rights Movement and Vatican II of the 1960s, the spread of secular materialism and what she regarded as a worldwide drift toward nihilism, and of course, her own suffering from lupus, which claimed her life at 39. With her ironic vision, she sees and depicts with humor the deadly consequences of human follies. Flannery O'Connor's ambivalences about the ambiguities and contradictions apparent in her region and the US at mid-century shaped her imagination in a world divinely created, but she thought degraded by sin and evil. Several notable character traits, combined with her aesthetic convictions and her unwavering commitment to her art, contribute to the prophetic inclination to bring the real and eternal into contact. Although O'Connor was deferential to the Southern culture on which she depended, she thought independently and was alienated from prevailing US cultural values. She lived both the overt and the undercurrent evidences of racism, poverty, and oppression. She refused, I think, to adopt social determinism or to align with preordained political or literary categories. Although reverent toward the mystery of the universe, O'Connor exhibited an irreverence toward those who sought to dominate nature and manipulate other human beings. Her appreciation for irony and her sardonic wit became effective literary means for exposing human absurdities and pointing toward mystery that evokes deeper reverence, if also provoking lingering questions. As you know, O'Connor was devoutly Catholic with, she said, a modern consciousness. That combination is evident in her wide and diverse reading in history, philosophy, science, and theology. Both her Catholicism and her modern consciousness led her first to read an article about Simone Weil in the Third Hour, concluding, perhaps facetiously and self-deprecatingly, that she probably couldn't understand her if she actually read Weil. However, after reading some of Weil's essays themselves and the notebooks available in English, O'Connor revised her opinion, saying, quote, "Simone Weil is a mystery that should keep us all humble," end quote. The religious and the anti-religious alike applaud O'Connor's works without necessarily delving into the challenges her prophetic imagination posed, both for author and readers alike.
So our manuscript is based on the perception that as Flannery O'Connor continued to read the writings of Simone Weil, she found in this French philosopher a kindred spirit, seeking to disclose the truth of the human condition in just treatment for all persons. Their prophetic imaginations brought to bear in that spiritual search make their thought relevant for today's pandemic upheaval, which has highlighted dangerous distortions existent in our society. Our parameters in juxtaposing the goals and styles of these two intellectual women were to do equal justice to each woman's creative contribution. The decade of working together allowed us to begin with a well-founded respect for the value of literature and for each other's work. Our principal aim was to show that philosophical concepts become clearer when embodied in fiction. And fiction is enlarged when read through the lens of philosophy. Simone Weil used fine literature in her teaching and writing to illustrate principles of human relationships. Flannery O'Connor's stories clearly entertained as they provoked readers to perceive basic truths in them. Now, Ruthann and I still had the very practical task of composing our manuscript. This took hours of give and take planning and then going meticulously over each other's contributions. In our final manuscript, we applied 8 principal Weilian concepts to 9 O'Connor stories. Today, to illustrate our process, we will briefly touch on 4 concepts: attention, apprenticeship, quote unquote, reading, and decreation, all apparent in O'Connor's The Artificial Nigger. In the interest of time, I will list 4 or 5 aspects of each, but we count on you to ask for further explanation. Now, attention involves renunciation, intellectual honesty, humility, and compassion, along with the desire to ask the sincere question of the suffering, what are you going through? Attention restores another's dignity and sense of self-worth, as in the Good Samaritan. It is an awakening of the individual consciousness through supernatural grace and an intimate relationship with justice. Attention requires an apprenticeship of disciplined effort and constant honing in order to read other persons in all their truth.
As you keep this concept of attention in mind, think of how O'Connor calls attention to details of the cosmic landscape, the psychological and spiritual states of her characters, her allusions to biblical narratives and historical references, and ways of presenting her characters as apprentices in attention.
Now, reading for Weil means seeing other persons as they would like to be seen, in a non-perspective way, through God's eyes, with love that inspires harmony, and with an inner disposition to seek the true reading.
I think the kind of reading through God's eyes that Weil calls for is similar to O'Connor's counsel that readers of her stories need anagogical vision, that is, the capacity to read beneath or beyond the surfaces, to see through to mystery.
Secondly, decreation means emptying out the ego, renouncing the belief in one's place as the center of the universe, cooperating with God in abolishing evil, and modeling one's behavior after God, who withdrew from the world so human beings could know freedom, loving relationships, and selfish love.
Whereas for Weil, the process of decreation is voluntary. O'Connor's characters encounter enforced decreations. In this historical moment, O'Connor's fiction suggests to me something perhaps akin to decreation, a necessary decolonizing of our minds, which have been appropriated by racism, sexism, and all attitudes that sustain systemic injustice. Now, my microphone keeps getting muted without my doing it, so I apologize. I'm turning briefly to The Artificial Nigger, which O'Connor thought was her favorite and best story, and in which we see several of Weil's concepts and a virtual rendering of grace that has personal and social implications suggested. As countless critics note, O'Connor's use of a disparaging label for African Americans in this story and in others makes teaching or discussing the story difficult. I will use O'Connor's word as she wrote it, arguing that her use of the label subverts its power by rendering the invisible repressed history of racial inequality visible. The Artificial Nigger opens on the beauty and order of a night world suffused in moonlight, as Grandfather Head rises in radiant pre-dawn light to prepare for a journey from the country to the city. Dimly mirroring Dante's sojourn in the underworld with Virgil as his guide, Mr. Head undertakes to educate his grandson Nelson about the realities of the city and race. On their trip, we witness a subtle transference of the sins of the father to the next generation through the moral gravity of prejudice, fear, egoism, racism, and betrayal. Throughout the story, O'Connor rivets the reader's attention on details of the external travel, the wide-eyed wonder of Nelson in the new landscape, and the characters' interior states of mind. Grandfather and grandson make ever-widening circles in the city, farther and farther away from the train station. Mr. Head shows Nelson the underground sewer system. Nelson encounters a variety of Black people, including the woman whose body and voice arouse his sensuality and sexuality and transfix him. Always on the verge of being lost, they move toward the central moment of betrayal. After hours of walking in the city, young, weary Nelson sits down against a building and falls asleep. Grandfather decides to hide behind the corner of the building so that when Nelson wakens, he won't have his bearings in place or person. Indeed, that is exactly what happens. When Nelson wakes, looks around, and can't see his grandfather, he starts running frantically. Mr. Head enjoys this spectacle from a short distance behind, until Nelson knocks over a woman carrying groceries. When Mr. Head appears and the woman asks him if this boy belongs to him, he denies him with a familiar ring, saying, "This is not my boy. I never seen him before." That betrayal afflicts both grandson and grandfather. Betrayed, isolated, and defiant, Nelson proceeds to walk alone about 20 paces behind his grandfather. Slowly, Mr. Head recognizes what he, in his self-righteous arrogance, has done. He occasionally tries to restore a relationship by suggesting that they get a Coca-Cola. Mr. Head's increasing anguished affliction illustrates Bay's concept of decreation, wherein, as egoism recedes, a void opens for the possibility of grace to enter. After Mr. Head waves and exclaims to a passerby that he is lost, they come upon a figure that stops them both. The narrator reports it is, quote, the plaster figure of a Negro sitting bent over on a low yellow brick fence, who was about Nelson's size, and he was pitched forward at an unsteady angle because the putty that held him to the wall had cracked. For them, it was not possible to tell if the artificial Negro were meant to be young or old. He looked too miserable to be either. He was meant to look happy because his mouth was stretched up at the corners. But the chipped eye and the angle he was cocked at gave him a wild look of misery instead, end quote. Mr. Head breathed. An artificial nigger. Stopping beside him, Nelson repeats in Head's exact tone, an artificial nigger. In that transfixing moment, the narrator observes that Head looked like an ancient child and Nelson like a miniature old man. Head intended to say something lofty, but heard himself say instead, they ain't got enough real ones here, they gotta have an artificial one. Quietly, Nelson replies, let's go home before we get ourselves lost. In that moment, Grace appears to be working through a plaster statue that dissolves, at least momentarily, the alienation between them, as it suggests that the whole construction of race is artificial and crumbling when viewed through mystery and the beauty and order of the world.
So Ruthann and I have considered that Simone Weil's relevance for today, which you saw well illustrated in the story Ruthann just told, her relevance is her stress on the mystery of God's love for all humankind, which becomes visible through the eternal beauty found in the natural world and in the fragile beauty of human relationships. Beauty for Weil is an implicit form of God's love for creation and a source for discerning truth and justice. Her reaction on reading the Gospels was to claim that they were so beautiful they had to be true. Their beauty lies in informing us of how to live in a social order rooted in love and justice. In this chaotic time of pandemic, in which fear of infection from the other tends to divide us, Simone Weil reminds us of our obligation to respect the sacredness of others by assuring everyone's essential needs. Only through sharing the world's resources through just means can we all survive. Both Weil and O'Connor emphasized the centrality of the incarnation to their lives and creative work. For neither of these writers was this an abstract, static theological theory. Each writer, in her individual way, regarded the incarnation of the divine in human form as the pattern, the imago Dei, imprinted in the universe and in each person, making all worthy of respect and love.
Flannery O'Connor recognized that the historical incarnation of God in Jesus Christ expresses truth, beauty, and love, but evoked conflict, rejection, suffering, and crucifixion. Incarnation is messy, and so are the intersections of the profane and the sacred, which O'Connor embodies in her stories. Through her close attention to individual bodies, their speech and actions, and the social body, she takes us unflinchingly to the heart of human craziness and darkness, where she sought to reveal mystery and truth. That in truth, we belong to God and to one another. When read deeply, her fiction complicates all our categories: theological, racial, sociological, gender, and invites recovery from entrenched racism and white privilege, which O'Connor understood takes time, a willingness to examine one's own assumptions, and abundant divine grace.
In conclusion, Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil saw mystery, beauty, the order of the world, and love of neighbor, even in degraded forms, as inexhaustible sources of truth concerning the human condition. Our book invites readers into serious engagement with the philosophy of Weil and the fiction of O'Connor. In this time of deepening fear of a deadly virus, unemployment, losses of shelter, food, and education, massive human migrations, and centuries of racial oppression, all pitted against longing for something we consider the old normal. Attempting to, quote unquote, read toward justice by alerting us to transcendent mystery, they call us to imagine and create something new from crumbling patterns and systems of injustice. Using her spiritual and literary gifts, Weil informs readers of inalienable obligations to others. Together, philosophy and fiction writer, born of the internal obstacles to fulfilling these obligations. Knowing the power of their craft, they marshaled their efforts in the struggle against social evils, the prevailing social evils, aware that these same forces had formed them. Their gift to us is their extraordinary ability to generate good from perpetual conflict, both internal and external. Through their art, they illustrate a redemptive way to live. Weil's religious philosophy unveils the sacred in our neighbor and in the cosmos. O'Connor's fiction reveals the consequences of social relations that lack true love of neighbor and render justice impossible. Thank you.
Now we look forward to your questions, comments, whatever you would like to say.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to go ahead and type them in the chat right now. Thank you so much, Jane and Ruthann. You've given us so much to think about and unpack with this conversation this evening. Looking at the scope of Flannery O'Connor's work and what has been in the news recently about O'Donnell's book and things like that, how do you think that we should examine not only O'Connor's work, but other authors' work whose racism has come into question, whose racist beliefs have come into question? You know, how can we sort of place it in order to not only teach it well, but make sure we have a full understanding of the times that it was written in and things like that?
It's an excellent and a difficult question, Joe. I think in teaching O'Connor, and I think this is one thing that O'Donnell's book in particular makes clear, is that she was herself wrestling with these issues, and that her fiction is a way of working out some of the contradictions that were clearly apparent. Paul Ely, in his article in the New Yorker about how racist was Flannery O'Connor, talks about her comments in some of her correspondence, particularly in her youth, and cautions us against judging her on the basis of what she wrote in her youth, but also not to ignore those. What I think is helpful is that we recognize that all of us, all human beings, are flawed, that we are all products of our social conditionings, and that those conditionings need to be confronted. That we try not to separate or bifurcate the work from the author, but to see in the act of creation that conflict and ambiguities, ambivalences can be creatively treated and actually contribute to leading us to newer places, to new understanding. One of the things that concerns me is that we do tend to divide people, and once they have demonstrated or exhibited a flaw, then to be dismissive or to say that is representing the whole of their value or their thinking. And if O'Connor does anything, it seems to me she forces us to face complexities and ambiguities in her characters, and a lot of resistance and a lot of denial to the truth of our situation. I think we all carry the imprints of racism.
Thank you so much for that response. We do have a few questions in the chat, so I'll get to those in order. But some of you who asked, of course, if you can purchase the book and if it's available at this time, Allie went ahead and posted the link again for Karis Books. You can just click on that and order directly from there, or feel free to give them a call when they're open tomorrow. So there's a question from Michael, and he asks, Jane, can you explain what you mean by supernatural grace?
Well, thank you, Michael. It's really a good question because grace can have sort of already built in different connotations for different people. For Simone Weil, grace is available to everyone. One needs only to ask for it sincerely. So that's the first issue. The second issue is that they believed that in the creation of the world, God actually withdrew from the world so that humanity and the cosmos could exist, and left the world to operate on its own mechanism, that God doesn't come in and interfere. However, the important thing is that there is grace offered to everyone. Now, that doesn't mean for Weil that God will come in and change all the things around, because we can just imagine with all the horrible suffering some people go through that it would change some small thing for one of us, but that living with suffering is so difficult. And that with a sincere, continued love of God, God will give the grace. He's not going to cure the illness, but he's going to give the grace to accept it well. The other thing is that almost everything that she's proposing is extremely difficult for human nature. The love of neighbor is not just love of our wonderful families and our friends whom we have chosen. Love of neighbor is truly love of the down and out, the dirty, the criminal, the person who acts perhaps totally different from your thoughts and has all sort of different ways. That's love of neighbor, just, and she uses continually the Good Samaritan, and it was just a bloody mass of flesh on the side. And so the Samaritan stopped, didn't think about what he had to do or his errands or where he was planning to spend his money, but he, as we all know the story, then stopped and took good care. And then, so that kind of attention is very hard for us to do. That kind of decreation is extremely hard for us to do. And we really mustn't think that we do it all by ourselves. I think she came to a real learning when she was working with the labor movement. It was so obvious, that was in a secular humanist period, it was so obvious that if these workers, they were much more numerous, if they gathered together their strength, they could get what they wanted, but they really couldn't do that. That's when, after a mystical experience, she realized that there are a great many things in our human condition that we actually can't do all by ourselves, that we need to be open to God's grace, and particularly in times in which we think, oh, why is this happening to me? And certainly we can imagine a great many people are thinking that in the suffering of today. So I don't know, Michael, if I've fully explained, but I think the essential is that grace is available to everyone. It is not an exclusive thing. And it really is quite necessary for us to do some of the very hard things that we're asked to do by the gospel.
Excellent. Thank you, Jane. Here's another question from Johnson, and he asks, O'Connor's most famous statement on Weil was that she wanted to write a novel with her as a perfect comic hero. How have you thought about that statement?
Well, in a way, I have several thoughts, and then I'm sure Ruthann will have some thoughts on that too, because then Flannery O'Connor follows it up in her letter, that you might think that comic and is something I really don't admire, but she said, that's exactly what I do admire. So she was already setting it up as an ambivalent. But you know, here was this Weil. She was a small person. She was probably one of the greatest minds in France. Nobel winner Miwash calls her the greatest gift of France in the 20th century. But she had ways that just simply didn't follow with certainly feminine expectations of feminine behavior at the time. And if you've seen pictures of her with her black cape, she was, I'm sorry to say, an inveterate smoker. And she was questioning everything. Nothing stopped her if it really didn't seem to have an element of truth in it. So she went against the whole hierarchy of the Catholic Church. She thought Roman Catholic liturgy was one of God's implicit gifts to humankind through his love. However, she was, so that was Simone Weil. So she also I lost my train of thought, but I wanted to say about the whole hierarchy, I think we see the same thing with Flannery O'Connor, in that Flannery O'Connor was certainly, as we would call, dyed-in-the-wool Catholic, but she has lots of remarks that shows that she recognizes the flaws in the Catholic Church. So Simone Weil said, to the Catholic Church, to various priests, I would really like to have baptism, but you must explain to me, and the Church must in public apologize for the Albigensian Crusade, in which they eliminated all the Cathars, for the Inquisition. And so here she is going against these massive groups, going against various governments, as a woman, and she went into her education. She was just about the only woman against men, and the men were very unwelcoming. So I kind of really think it's an interesting comment that, if you didn't care that much about what she was saying, it would seem like this little woman who was doing everything contrary to what society was accepting. So that's my reflection on it, I'm sure. Ruthann, I'm sure you have something to add to that.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that goes along with that comment by O'Connor that Weil was the perfect blend of the comic and the terrible is that she said if she could, she'd really like to write a story about her. But she concluded that the only way you can write a story about anyone, is if you can dominate that figure enough to move it around in the ways that you want to move it around, or you think it wants to move around. And she could not do that with Simone Weil. I think another reason that she may have thought that, at least initially, thought of her as the perfect blend of the comic and terrible, was influenced by her early readings of Weil, and also by some of the official Catholic hierarchy's opinion of Weil, which was dismissive. And in part it was dismissive because of her unwillingness to join the Catholic Church. And so, but I think after O'Connor read Weil for herself, she obviously changed her opinion. I'd say one other thing about the comic and the terrible. They are like two sides of the same coin. That the terrible can be intense, and the intensity, which can be terrifying, can have its own elements of comedy in it. So it's a complicated relationship. Yeah, I think that's where I would leave that for now.
Excellent. So we do have a few more questions coming in. We have one actually, Diego, who's joining us this evening from Argentina. So, bienvenidos. So Diego asks, Flannery read Simone Weil's Letter to a Priest. What did she think about that book?
Jane, do you know?
Well, she hasn't. So we tracked down. So Ruthann, you build on what I have to say. We've tracked down what she had in her library, which she from Simone Weil, that what she received from friends. So we know she had the notebooks, which are very dense, staccato kind of entries of Simone Weil's thought. They're very, very packed and powerful. We know she had Waiting for God, which is a series of essays put together by the Dominican priest and her beloved mentor, Father Perrin. And then we assume she probably had Gravity and Grace, but that actually is just extracts from the notebook. And so with a letter to a priest, she doesn't actually mention any of the specific essays that she would have read. She mentions only her reaction to Simone Weil. And so in the letter to the priest, which was written to the Père Couturier, and actually there are 36, if I'm not mistaken, objections to the Catholic hierarchy. And of course you can see one priest pastor to another and another. I mean, what are we going to do with this woman? So I'm sure they were making remarks that she was comic also, but without the same respect. And so Simone Weil categorizes these issues that she has with the Catholic Church, and it never got an answer. However, we do know from the archives of the Père Couturier, who died himself rather young, he was preparing an answer before he finally died. So I have to guess. And I imagine that because they were deeply sincere objections to the authoritarian way of the Catholic Church, that Flannery O'Connor was not blind to this. And for example, they did feel that the Church has every right to be a protective, to be protective about the dogma. Dogma is just fine, but they can't impose it on people. Dogma is meant to be contemplated and loved if you can reflectively accept it. So that's just an extrapolation, but I'm sure that Ruthann has more to say.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question, and it is one that we do not have a definitive answer to. And that's partly because we have not found examples where we can say, oh, these are her notations on this particular letter or this particular essay. We know what she read because we have evidence of what she had. We know from whom she got the works. And so we can't answer your question in detail there. I do think, however, as Jane has pointed out, that Flannery was very critical herself. I mean, she had a thoughtful, reflective mind, and she was not afraid to raise questions or to make sardonic comments about the abuse of power in the church. So I think that I think we really just have to assume that she would have been open to those kinds of criticisms. She does mention 3 thinkers that for her are the most important thinkers of the 20th century, and they were all women. Simone Weil was one of them, Edith Stein was another, and Hannah Arendt was the third one, which I think you will find interesting in that these are clearly independent thinkers raising questions about the social orders, the religious practices of the religions.
Excellent. Let me pull up a couple of the other questions. Let's see. It's like, One from Bob. If, according to Weil, God does not intervene to limit human freedom, what hope does O'Connor's fiction give us that we will overcome racism? Actually, and there's a second question from Belinda that kind of, I think, would dovetail into your response to that. And she says, thank you for saying that we all carry racism. I think that's why the article poses the question, how racist was O'Connor? Meaning it's not a question of if she were racist or not, but how racist was she? Are we going to start having degrees of racism in order to relieve whites of the guilt associated with being racist?
Well, let me tackle, both of them are just excellent, and thank you for both of them. Let me tackle Bob's thought, because we're really not supposed to just wait for God to descend and make things better. As I implied, the Gospels show us a way of life. And if anything was essential to, I think, both women, but let me take Simone Weil, and that is love of neighbor. And in order to truly love your neighbor, you have to give attention. In order to fully give attention, you have to get rid of all your own ego. And so it seems to me that what we have in the Gospels, and I do think that Simone Weil felt this way strongly, that what we have is a beautiful exposition of a way of life. So what she does feel about that is that when we do truly love our neighbor, when we truly do help out the down and out and those that are in most need, we are really being a vehicle of God. God is not coming in and doing it him or herself, but we are the vehicle that allow this to take place. And so that's what we're supposed to do. We have the roadmap. And we are offered, back to the first question, in Weil's religious philosophy, we're offered the grace to be able to have the strength to do this. And it's not easy. If I could refer just to one of my favorites of Flannery O'Connor, which is Revelation, when Ruby Turpin at the end really sees that the hierarchy of the world is not at all what she thought, but there she is in the deep south. What is she going to do? How is she going to change it? Now, I have no suggestion. I don't carry it any further than Flannery O'Connor does, but O'Connor shows us that changing so there truly is love of neighbor, and I think we can find that in many of O'Connor's stories, is extremely difficult.
I want to respond to both of those questions too, because I think they're very, very good questions. Throughout O'Connor's stories, of course, there is confrontation of one's own or her characters, self-centeredness, egoism, arrogance, tendency to classify people as worthy and as unworthy. In that sense, we are all unequal because we're all targets of our own sinfulness, our own egoism. What she really is pointing out, and I suppose this could be interpreted as hope in O'Connor, is that we really all do need some form of decreation and some recovery of where we truly belong, where our home is as human beings. That's not an easy answer. And the question about degrees of racism, are we going to now calculate degrees of racism? I think we are all afflicted, as I said earlier. And I think that is what O'Connor is exploring in herself, and certainly in the stories that she writes, through which we, I hope, begin to confront some of our own attitudes. That's where the hope is. I don't see that she is laying out a roadmap and all you have to do is get on the right road, and as soon as you're on the right road, you're going to be an anti-racist. It is hard work. As she says, it takes a long time. And she would say, an awakening to who's you really are as a human being, how you belong in the human community. I will refer briefly to the story of Revelation as well. It's a good story for, I think, estimating whether there are degrees of racism, because if you know the story at the beginning, Mrs. Turpin has the categories perfectly picked out, and she and Claude, as landowners and white, are at the head of the band going toward heaven. But by the end of the story, through her own confrontation, being confronted with her own arrogance, she has at least revised the order. But there still is an order, though she and Claude have now been moved to the lower rung on the ladder. So this does take a long time, folks, but that isn't to say that we should not begin the work immediately.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We do have a question from a raised hand in the room. So Tolliver Williamson, don't forget to unmute yourself real quick, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
In the book, Waiting for God, Simone Weil refers a section of that to friendship. So I wonder if you could comment on friendship and the different ways that the two of them saw friendship. I know Flannery O'Connor had a long friendship with Betty Hester, and Simone Weil had a friendship with a priest, but she was never baptized in the faith, I think. So I would like you to comment on the different ways that the two of them saw friendship.
Well, Simone, let me start then, Ruthann, because Simone Weil does have the fourth part of her essay on the forms of God's implicit love for us. And they are beauty, and they are liturgy, and they are love of neighbor. And then she adds, actually, almost as a second thought, of friendship. And because she puts that as a side from, true love, and she thought very highly of friendship, of friends, having friends. She, in her, I think, humility, other people make rather other psychological analyses, she was not one to go out and make friends. She felt that if she had a friendship, she did in Simone Petremont, who wrote her biography, and in one or two others, but she felt very strongly that her vocation was going to limit her to doing just that. She was at a marvelous gift. If anyone hasn't read Simone Weil, she writes with clarity and order and beautiful images and lots of references to literature. It's just a wonderful read to have that. And she knew she had this gift, and she was honing this gift from very early on. And then she really felt she had a message to disseminate with her gift. And so she didn't feel she had really time, and she didn't actually feel, it's kind of like this person gritting her teeth and moving toward what needs to be moved to, moving toward God. She didn't really feel that she needed to spend a lot of time with others, but others obviously had an enormous respect for her. So it's A true friendship, she thought, is one of the forms of God's implicit love for us. And I think it's a very beautiful thought. And that whole essay is just very inspiring.
You're absolutely right to mention the friendship that Flannery O'Connor had with Betty Hester. As her correspondence reveals, she depended a lot, particularly because with her disease of lupus, she had to retreat to Andalusia. She had been sort of headed to the east, to the northeast for a literary career. When she was stricken with lupus, she ended up at home on the farm of Andalusia, living with her mother. She says in an interview, actually early, right after she published Wise Blood, that one needs to know one's region. And in order to know one's region, one needs to know oneself. And once you know your region and the world, she went on to say it's not just your region, it's the world, then you have to be in exile from it. Now this poses a lot of, I think, paradoxes, because to be in exile is in a way to be alone. And she clearly was alone. She needed to be alone to do her work, which became increasingly important to her because she knew that her life would be short. But in that aloneness, in that isolation, she also really needed friendship, and friendship came through her letters. They came through correspondence. And Betty Hester, she and Betty Hester exchanged letters every 2 weeks. I think it would be interesting, I don't know that anybody has done this yet, to put together every 2 week. I've read those, and it's a fascinating exchange. When Betty Hester revealed to her, this is some quality, I think, of Flannery O'Connor's devotion as a friend. When Betty Hester revealed to her that she was a lesbian, Flannery O'Connor wrote back and said, "This does not change my love for you, my caring and respect for you." She was not afraid to tell people what she thought about things, and sometimes in very sarcastic and very funny ways. But I think all of those attributes are qualities of friendship, I think, that were very, very important to her. And they're related, it seems to me, to what Weil talks about when she talks about reading people in the way that they want to be seen, in reading them from God's point of view. I think that may be what O'Connor, at her best, is able to do. And maybe she helps us to read better because of that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Just a reminder, if you have any last minute questions, folks, feel free to type them in or go ahead and just use the raise your hand feature and we'll recognize you. Another one from Johnston came in and it asks, if I were to live, it's a quote, and it says, if I were to live long enough and develop as an artist to the proper extent, I would like to write a comic novel about a woman. And what is more comic and terrible than an angular, intellectual, proud woman approaching God inch by inch with ground teeth? I think that's in reference to the other question that we had earlier. And actually, we just had another question come in from Jennifer that asks, are her ideas about exile synonymous with her views on detachment?
You're talking about Flannery O'Connor's ideas about exile, of course, since I just mentioned that. and detachment, yes, I think they are. I would think they are related very much. Exile is the capacity to stand outside, not to identify with, not to become attached to that which is, which are prevailing cultural values or prevailing ways of thinking, sort of standard assumptions. I think exile also has a meaning because the biblical history, the Hebrew scriptures, the Christian scriptures were important to O'Connor. And so exile is where she often found God's people in exile. And the prophets were often on the outskirts in exile, trying to create a connection or to call people back into some kind of relation with the sacred, with the ground of their being. And to do that does require a quality of detachment from that which dominates or wants to control and rule our lives.
Well, and if I were to take, it's really wonderful to put the ideas of exile, thank you, Jennifer, of exile and detachment together, because both of them are complex. Both words can have complex meaning. Exile can also be forced. And the exile that Simone Weil was anxious about were, of course, the people who were being ripped up from their homeland, from where their languages were destroyed, where their religion were destroyed. And so that was a forced exile. So when you take that aspect, and that's only one of many, and compare it with detachment, detachment is an interior choice. You choose really to give attention to the other without allowing all your own needs and all your preoccupations and all your previous plans coming into interference, so that, and then that is detachment with a purpose. Therefore, you can also have detachment where you're just sort of floating around and not caring, but detachment with a purpose is you're detaching so you can help the other. I think both women were in exile by choice and by the nature of things, in that they knew they had a gift, they had a message to disseminate, and they were going to simply concentrate on it. It's with Simone Weil would get back to the friendship also, and then even with Flannery O'Connor in having to increasingly be away from the society that she liked on the farm. But it was an exile that in both cases, I suspect they accepted it with a bitter love, because it allowed them to concentrate on what they felt that they had to do. So it's a very good idea to put the two together. It's a wonderful idea. I'm going to jot it down, use it perhaps. Thank you.
And actually, Jennifer had a follow-up to that asks that she says she was reading one of Weil's essays about detachment, and are Weil's and O'Connor's views on that subject fairly similar? Which I think you just probably touched on slightly right there at the end.
I'm not sure what to add for that. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Ruthann? Would you?
Well, I think we've sort of tried to address that. I don't know that I have any evidence, concrete written evidence that, where O'Connor is saying, I think this way just the way they did. But I think as Jane pointed out, detachment is usually a choice. And I think for O'Connor, she does, she has to be detached enough from her own personal subjective preoccupations in order to enter into the creation of another fictional world and a character. And so that is a willed detachment, it seems to me, necessary for the habit of art that she had committed herself to.
Excellent. And let's go ahead and we have one final question for the evening from Angela. And she asks, what do you think of the recent decision of Loyola University to remove Flannery O'Connor's name from one of their dormitories in reaction to the recent attention given to her use of racial slurs in her personal letters?
I think that's a very, very good question. I think it's one that should trouble us all. I think it is a too narrow reading of O'Connor. And I think we have to be very, very careful about, as I said earlier, sort of dividing what a person may say in one stage of his or her life, maybe in private correspondence, with what one's work represents, what whole work represents. I think there is the tendency to, on all of our parts, to think that our artists ought to be unflawed human beings, that they should be immune from any kind of conditioning, social conditioning, that all the rest of us have experienced and are shaped by. So I think there needs to be a significant number of O'Connor friends, scholars have written in response to that action, opposing it, urging people to think more carefully about what we are doing when we make a decision on the basis on only one slice of a person's life without considering the whole of the person's life and work.
Yeah, and to add to that, Jennifer, since that's just come up, it's very much on the minds of people who admire Flannery O'Connor. And I was trying to put myself in the place of the president of Loyola University in Maryland and thinking, well, if you've got a strong student body and they're standing up and they're taking a stand, what would you do? And I was thinking how neat it would be if some of the faculty could form a discussion group and then take Flannery O'Connor's stories, perhaps they've already been teaching them in their English department, and take the stories, look at them carefully. Now, most of these letters, and of course it's hard to comment on this because most of these letters are just coming out. They have been protected. Now, Paul Ely referred to them as juvenilia, so one is assuming, but that's all, only by that word, that perhaps they were her younger point of view. But this O'Donnell book seems to be starting only really partway through it, to be handling this in good reason. But it seems like, well, as we used to say, it'd be a marvelous teaching moment. Okay, what do we do about this? Here she is, here's a person, here are letters. I see it as a marvelous educational opportunity, rather than have a quickie decision that really could be considered sort of dismissively as a knee-jerk reaction just because. And besides, she's so controversial because she uses the vernacular labels for Black people. But of course, there too, if you see them in context, and then it's just the very part that Ruthann wrote, they're not always the derogatory word. It depends on who's speaking and what the context is. So personally, but you know, nobody's asking me to be the president of their university, I thought it was a great moment for teaching that was lost.
Maybe it's not lost, Jane. I mean, who knows? Maybe there can be some reconsideration, but I do agree that there are plenty of opportunities for teaching in such moments. We've got a lot of moments like this in our midst right now.
Wonderful. I think that's a great point to make. I think we're all sort of re-examining not only what's going on in society, but you know, maybe even our own personal actions, our own personal inactions in what is going on right now. You know, like Ibrahim Kendi says, it's not just enough, you know, to not be racist, but you need to be anti-racist at the same point. So, but thank you all so much for joining us. This was an absolutely wonderful discussion. Thank you so much to Ruthann and Jane. Thank you to Mercer University Press, great publishing house right here in Georgia. Of course, not only did this particular book, the other Flannery O'Connor book that we presented, the Carson McCullers book. We're so pleased to hear that Carlos Dews is continuing the Carson McCullers series. So look forward to more books examining great Georgia authors as well, coming from them. Don't forget, you can pick up copies of those by either calling or clicking on the link and ordering from Karis Books. And probably during this discussion, if you were like me, you were reaching to the shelf to get your copy of course, The Complete Stories of Flannery O'Connor. I've already got mine marked up a little bit, ready to go. If you don't have a copy, just go ahead and throw that in the cart and have Karis ship one to you. It's probably not going to be this pretty copy because this cost me a pretty penny. But it will be a lovely new edition paperback. I'm sure you can read and continue on your study of this subject. Once again, thank you all so very, very much for coming. We hope you will continue to join our events, you'll continue reading, and we will see you all again very, very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you to everyone. We really appreciated your questions.
Great evening.
Oh, there